Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. Now, just before I start, I thought I might warn all those admirals, generals and air marshals about what you have to say very carefully when you're talking to the media, because this is what one general said about aeroplanes in 1910. And despite his views, being the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the British Army formed the Royal Flying Corps in 2 years afterwards. And so despite the fact that there was an aeroplane, this is actually taken the Salisbury plane during army manoeuvres, and despite the fact that the general had a spotter in an aeroplane who was dropping messages written about the enemy positions and the fall of shots, placed into an old tin, taped up with a streamer and thrown over the side, getting on-the-spot intelligence, he still believed it was a useless fad. We move on. Now, I did some research into the first use of the air medium really to support army operations, particularly in the field. And this gentleman here, a rather dapper-looking Frenchman, Jean-Baptiste Jourdain, painted at the Battle of Fleurus in 1794. He's using a balloon, you can see it in the distance there, and it gave him unfettered access to the enemy's manoeuvres. Now, at the time, who was the enemy? It was a combination of forces, 80,000 troops on both sides. The French, this is the first battle of the Republic, versus the British, Hanoverian, Habsburg, and Dutch empires combined. And in this case, the French actually won. And in part put down to the fact that the general had air intelligence. Now, the idea caught on, and eventually the idea of using observation balloons for artillery spotting, infantry manoeuvre reporting and so forth. Certainly the American Civil War, the Boer War, the Franco-Prussian War, all those forces on both sides started to use balloons and observers in tethered balloons in particular. And these lucky chaps, this fellow's got binoculars, they also had early telephones with wires, no radios at the time, but very soon their infantry mates called them balloonatics. For the obvious reason that they were very flammable, filled with hydrogen, and inevitably this was the result. And it led, of course, to the issuing of parachutes, despite the fact that parachutes were not issued to airmen with aircraft because it might encourage them to leave the plane. So yeah. Now, I'll give you a shot of this very early BE-2A, 1914 model. And I'd just like to point out a few features because it's very important that you see how they change even through the very early parts of the war. So this is flying just before the start of the First World War. Pilot, you'll note, is in the rear seat. That would mean that the observer sat in the forward seat. Problem? Wing, 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 wing. Visibility was only towards the rear and fairly limited. Looking out the front, you had the propeller moving, very blurred image if you're trying to look through a propeller. You're also getting covered in castor oil. Lubricant of those engines, 80 horsepower, about the size of a mini bike engine now. Run with castor oil as lubricant. Blew into your face. Castor oil is a laxative. It gave you the obvious trouble. So it wasn't a pleasant place to be. No guns at all. Very manoeuvrable, but also and quite slow, which has an advantage. So that's really the very early days of aviation. Very soon, though, certainly by the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, March 2015, the pilots they figured it out pretty quickly that it was easier for the pilot to sit up the front. Your observer, later a gunner, but no guns on this aircraft. But certainly photography was in its prime in this case because you're manoeuvring, you're being shot at, bad weather. You, as an observer, are trying to plot the fall of shot from the artillery on a Morse key, type a code back to the ground, and then watch for enemy aircraft and watch for the next fall of shot for corrections. It all happens very quickly. And so what they started to do was take mosaic photos of the front lines. You can see them reporting here. Photos are very quickly developed became photo maps of the front lines, which actually gave the ground commanders up-to-date imagery and changes to not only the enemy positions, but as they bombarded things and villages disappeared, they could actually get a lay of the land as it was at the time. And so the combination of airmen, the photographers and liaison officers, which they started to place in both into the squadrons and into the battery commanders area, started very quickly. The liaison officer at the squadron had phone contact with the battery commander, and any corrections to the change of targeting would be sent through over the wire, given to the aircrew, and they would then go and fly a mission. So we now have aircraft starting to be used for more practical reasons. As yet, they're still not shooting at each other in the air because this is still fairly early days. That comes a bit later. I digress slightly now to talk about 3 Squadron Australian Flying Corps. British formed the Royal Flying Corps in 2012. We started the idea of a flying corps at the same time. It was a few years later before we got going, but we certainly had an Australian Flying Corps before the start of the First World War. We ended up with 4 operational squadrons, 4 training squadrons, and the training organisations back in Australia. Number 3 squadron was the Army Corporation Squadron, which we provided to the Western Front. Now, how would the RFC divide its squadrons? They divided into Army squadrons and Corps squadrons. Army squadrons were responsible for the broader front, control of the air, regional mapping and so forth. Corps squadrons were dedicated to the role of supporting the Corps Commander and his requirements. And so they were the dedicated squadrons that the Royal Flying Corps had put in place for need. 3 Squadron did an exceptional job. They came in about late 17, went right through to the end of the war, Battle of Canberra, and then eventually across La Hamel, where they were quite instrumental in supporting Monash's push forward, and with some very innovative ideas, including mounting 2 guns on the turrets, using supply dropping to supply ammunition to the troops on the ground, and more dedicated air-ground work. So I think it's worth mentioning them right now. I know you Army guys love pamphlets, doctrine. Very soon, where are we? 1916, this is a later edition, but they certainly had a cooperation of aircraft with artillery pamphlet. 64 pages. It is not a simple job. And I'll show you some of the techniques they used, but the pamphlet goes into extreme detail both for airmen and for infantry and artillery officers and the troops as well. It covers every detail. Excuse me. Excuse me a minute. Okay, one of the first earliest methods they used was shoot celluloid. An old piece of film, hadn't been exposed, it was clear. And marked on it the range scales, direction is north, obviously, at clock place. And at some point, they would be selecting a geographic position on a map. So the guys on the ground had to have the same one as the guys in the air. It might be prominent crossroads, corner of a village. It might be something in the target area which was identifiable both in the air and on the ground. And target position would be called, and this is particularly important for counter-battery fire, because the counter-battery fire was often the most difficult. Out of range or out of sight from the guys on the ground, often hidden, camouflaged, and so forth. And so you're calling basically in blind. And let's say your target is at this position here. Well, the call would be B4. So wing B, which means 100 yards from the centre, and it's about 4 o'clock. So that would be the initial call, and then the battery commander would put fire onto B4, and the airman would then transmit corrections. So if it was a little bit out, and it might have been, say here, you might say B, and you have a lot of other codes. I won't go into it, but you can see how they creep forward and eventually get to the target. And this would be an ongoing thing, so the flights would last about 3 hours. So as one counter battery fired, one counter battery was hit, they'd move on to the next one, or other targets. They would also do creeping fire and so forth. It all got very complicated very quickly, but it seemed to work. A reasonably simple system, but of course, as we military do, we have to make it more complicated. And they did. Here's an example. This is Jack Allport, 3 Squadron. I'm not quite sure where it is, but the date is the 20th of the 4th, 18. So it's a little bit later in the war, but the same idea is prevalent here. That little point there is obviously a reference point that the folks on the ground have already identified. And you can see where the first shot out is made in the range. Of course, this is the target where there's someone here. It might be crossroads, something like that. This is a photograph taken with this superimposed on it afterwards. It did get more complicated as the war went on. The charts became more detailed. We had a more detailed zone system. The point W was set on a grid, which was marked on charts and on photographs. So the central point is OW, it's just a random letter. And if we concentrate on this side here, you notice it's B11 or it's an X. X is the next sheet. So you can have overlapping sheets. So it gets complicated. So that means you have to have the same maps here and ground, you have to have the same scale of maps, and you have to have the same overlay matrix. Otherwise it doesn't work. And in this case, the grid is a 6,000 yard grid, so basically 1,000 yards square. And the call of WB, W is the map reference, B is the quadrant, 10 is the subsection, and target N1 is just a nominal name they were given to various targets briefly before they left. And they might have had 20 different targets to attack in that mission. And so that's the gist of it. Now, the pamphlet goes into extraordinary detail. There are rows and rows of subcodes underneath that. I'm not even trying to explain them. But very quickly, the airman, typing in the Morse, would rattle off target position rather than have to talk about, grid reference this, listings, northings, and all that stuff. You could rattle it off very quickly, and you could draw fire onto the target very quickly as well. It's simple. So that was the zone system, and it was we started coming in about 1917. Now, here's a photograph using that zone system. This is an R zone. Koyat, I'm not sure whether that's appeared yet, but it's one of those grids of cards. And you can see there's been some markings on the photograph that our airman or somebody has marked. They seem to like sausages. Anyway, there's a sausage up there too. So consequently, this little red zone is the one I've highlighted because I'm going to show you a picture of what it looks like on Google Earth in a minute. But within that zone, you can then imagine them calling different target areas within those various points. I'm not sure what the targets were in this case. That says bank. I think that also has a bank as well, so whether the enemy or on banks, I don't know. You can see how that was applied now. Imagine how many square miles of France they would have to photograph, grid reference, chart. Quite a substantial effort, but they put a lot of effort into it. That's what it looks like today. It's a rather open field area, little clumps of trees. I'll just go back and show you. There's sort of still vague bits of it. The town looks pretty much the same. It doesn't look like it's grown too much. Where it is. And so consequently, you wouldn't even know that there was a major campaign going on 100 years ago. Although they tell me French people at the time still give up the experts from time to time and occasionally one of those off in prison. So that's how they did the zone system. coming forward. We've come a fair way since the early days of air observation and recording artillery shots. We went through a period in between the wars where some of these ideas were refined, particularly in Iraq and the Middle East and Mesopotamia. And then, of course, we had World War II, which really cemented a lot of the air-ground operation, and we started to see more of the workplace air support aircraft being created and used. And by Vietnam, we had really specialist aircraft like the Bronco here, firing a smack marking missile to the marking target for the artillery or marking for the other enemy. And I'm sure you've seen the movies and the pictures somewhere go on about those. But every now and then, we fail to learn lessons, and we talked about joint fires before. There is lessons to be learned about combining the air with artillery shells and air weapons. Here's one of those lessons. Unfortunately, this is the US Army Caribou. It got hit by artillery, flew through an artillery barrage, and it's a laughing picture, but unfortunately the three crewmen killed, just landed just in here in this paddock. And they were just watching it come down, it just flew over, hit the tail off, and it crashed. So, fire control zones, and you've got to exactly know where you are over the airspace to make sure that you're not flying through someone else's artillery barrage. You might not even be in your sector. And so consequently, we do practice, this is the Air Marshal said before, we are very careful about how we do conflict and do our joint fires these days. It's very well scripted because it has to be. In a complex environment like, say, Baghdad a few years ago, very limited airspace, a lot of stuff flying around in there, all different services, all different nationalities, some from the ground, some from the air. It's extremely complex. So with that, I kept to my 10 minutes. Thank you very much.